as the slide says, I'm Thomas, and I'm going to be talking to you about blockchain. If I can make the slides go, which is always... Here we go. So in my defense, this is not my laptop, so that if I can't operate it, it's not just the standard inept person talking. So a bit of an outline before I begin. What I'm going to do is go through 4 areas. I'm going to talk first about the foundations of blockchains, and probably for many of you, you may already know this stuff about sort of how they work, what the kind of ingredients that go into it are. Then I'm going to talk about some things that blockchain is particularly good at, some things that blockchain is particularly bad at, and some sort of future direction, some kind of interesting future developments, which I think are probably going to happen in the next few years with blockchain. So I'm going to start by giving a definition of blockchain, because I think my definition is a bit different from at least how it tends to get used in marketing, and is probably good if we're on the same page. So for me, a blockchain is a decentralized distributed system for establishing a public ledger of transactions. So for me, there's quite a strong emphasis on the fact that it's not just a database. If you have a database with some checksums, that's lovely. But we had those before Bitcoin, if you remember. They weren't invented in the last 10 years. So I'm going to focus mainly on that first part. But I think actually if you look at what's happened in blockchain in the last 10 years, that part people kind of don't care about. Like, you get a lot of private blockchains and permission blockchains because people don't really care if it's distributed. What they really seem to be interested in is the well-defined language to describe transactions. So even with something like, even with Bitcoin, and obviously there are a lot more expressive ones since, even with Bitcoin, you can already do interesting kind of lottery systems where Bitcoin enforces the correctness of the lottery, or you can do various things with its transaction. And so I think, I'm not going to talk very much about that second point, but I think it's worth noticing that when you hear people talk about what excites them about blockchain, it's very rarely the thing that I think is sort of core blockchain business. It's much more what you're doing on the blockchain. Okay, so now that I've given a rough kind of definition, I'm going to sort of start at the basics and have a run-up about how you might have ended up with something that's a bit like Bitcoin. So in this talk, I'm going to say blockchain a lot, and what I'm going to say is almost always true for Bitcoin, and it's normally reasonably true for the others, but it's just a convenient one to go to. So here's the idea. We have some kind of public ledger, some kind of public book that everybody can look at, and on this book is everybody's balance. So there's everybody's names, and there's an amount of money they have. And now Alice wants to pay Bob 3 units, and you can tell I'm a cryptographer because all of my stories involve Alice and Bob. So Alice wants to pay Bob 3 units, and Alice requests that it's put in the ledger a transaction saying Alice pays Bob 3 units. And this goes to the maintainer of the ledger, and the maintainer of the ledger checks that Alice in fact has at least 3 units, and that Alice really made the request, and then they record in the ledger that the transaction has occurred, and of course the balances are suitably updated. So this is kind of the rough idea. This is how you might want to think about the financial kind of transactions that happen in Bitcoin, but obviously there's a lot wrong with this rough idea. So in particular, there's no anonymity here. It's just Alice and Bob. You can know exactly who's paying who, how much money, and that's not great in almost any context. Secondly, there's no authorization verification. It's just the ledger gets an email from somebody saying, I want Alice to pay Bob 3 units. Did Alice send that transaction? Did Bob send that transaction? You've got no idea. And I said there's this person who maintains the ledger, which kind of contradicts the decentralized nature of the ledger that I talked about in my very definition. And so Bitcoin has sort of 3 approaches that it takes to solving these problems. And the first one for anonymity is pseudonyms. So I think probably most of you know this. In Bitcoin, you don't pay money to a person, you pay money to an address. And in theory, it's possible that we don't know which person corresponds to which address. Now, in practice, the anonymity is not that great in Bitcoin, but at least in theory, there's some kind of pseudo-anonymity. To get around the authorization verification, it uses digital signatures, so that address is basically a public key, and I send it to the public key, and then that public key can spend it by making a signature. So the person who controls the private key of the address is the person who controls the address. And then the really interesting part of Bitcoin, and actually all of the decentralized blockchains, is this last point. It's about how do you incentivize the community to maintain this ledger accurately. So So there are kind of three main cryptographic ingredients that go into Bitcoin, and it's still true for, I think, most of the blockchains, even though there's a lot of fancier stuff starting to come in. The first ingredient is hash functions. In particular, Bitcoin uses SHA-256 and RIP-MD160. And it uses cryptographic puzzles, which is how the proof of work system works, and this is Hashcash is the name of that system, and it's built on top of SHA-256. And then for the authorization, it uses digital signatures and public keys, and it uses something called ECDSA, which I'll talk about in a minute. So I think most of you probably know what a hash function is. A hash function is a function, so it takes some input, it produces some output, and it condenses an arbitrary length message to a fixed length digest. So you take sort of any message size you want, and you get a digest. Now that on itself is not that complicated. What makes it more complicated is the properties that it's supposed to achieve. So in particular, we expect three properties of hash functions. We expect them to be collision resistant, we expect them to be preimage resistant, and we expect them to be second preimage resistant. So collision resistance means you can't find two distinct messages A and B such that they hash to the same thing. Preimage resistance means given a hash H, you can't find a message X that hashes to it. And second preimage means that given a message A, you can't find another message B such that the hashes are equal. Now, this kind of stuff doesn't tend, at least in my experience, to get talked about a huge amount at security conferences. But if you get excited about developments with hash chains, like whether SHA-1 is now broken or MD5 is broken, you should probably learn the difference between these three, because they are three very different properties. And for instance, both SHA-1 and MD5 are not collision resistant, but they are still preimage resistant and second preimage resistant. So that actually means in most blockchain contexts at the moment, you could use MD5, which is an incredibly kind of not great hash function, and it wouldn't actually break anything. Because in blockchain, in almost every case, what you care about is these last two properties. There's a couple of Ethereum contracts where in the contract logic, they end up requiring collision resistance, but generally speaking, it's always the last two properties. So as I said, Bitcoin uses SHA-256 and RIP-MD160. And for these systems, there's a targeted bits of security. So for those of you who aren't familiar with this notation, when you talk about security in cryptography, you normally talk about sort of a targeted bits of security. And it's basically how many operations you should need to do to break it. And it's not like that many just straight there. It's when you raise it to the 2 to the power, whatever your security parameter is. So the expectation here is that you should require about 2 to the 180 bits of computation to break SHA-256 in its collision resistance, 2 to the 256 for preimage resistance, and 2 to the 256 for the second preimage resistance. And every extra bit of security you add doubles the effort to break the system. So these are basically infeasible amounts of computation to do. And as I said before, the difference really matters. And if you're doing something where you care about hash functions for security purposes, it's good to know which one you want. So cryptographic puzzles are one of the really major things in Bitcoin. And so for those of you who aren't familiar with this, the idea actually came around about 35 years ago now, I think. You first saw cryptographic puzzles get invented. And the idea at that point was actually for spam protection. So I have a server, and you send me a request, and I do something for you. And so now I'm getting too many requests. I'm getting basically DDoSed. So I want to make sure the requests I'm getting are sort of more genuine requests. And the way this is done is I say to you, OK, here's a puzzle. If you want me to process your request, give me a solution to this puzzle. And it basically forces you to make some effort to send me a request that I'm going to accept. And so I won't go into the nitty-gritty of how these things work very much, but the idea here is that these puzzles are extremely easy to generate and extremely easy to verify, but arbitrarily hard to solve. And so this allows me to very efficiently check how much sort of effort you put in. So the example I'm going to give is basically equivalent to what happens in Bitcoin up to some kind of technical details. So if you have a hash function h, which has k bits of output, let's interpret that output as basically an unsigned integer. So it's a number between 0 and 2 to the k minus 1. Now let s be a string and let t be an integer, and you want to find a value x such that the hash of x concatenated to s is less than t. So s here is effectively the description of the puzzle. T is like how hard the puzzle is, and X is the solution to the puzzle. And this is basically what happens with Bitcoin. In Bitcoin's case, S is kind of the data about the previous blocks and the transaction for that blocks, and T is whatever the current difficulty is in Bitcoin, and the job of the person is to find an X such that it fits, and if you find it, here's a whole bunch of money. So you then use these systems in Bitcoin in something called proof of work. And the idea here is you want to assume, and this is what Bitcoin does, that the computational power of the honest parties is greater than the computational powers of the attacker. And we want it to be the case that if that's true, if the honest powers have more computational power than the adversary, then the system behaves correctly for some definition of correctness. And so this is actually the real game in blockchain currencies, at least from a cryptographic point of view. When you design a new cryptocurrency, if you're doing something interesting, this is the thing that you should be having trouble to prove. And what you should be having trouble to prove is that the incentive system actually forces rational players to behave honestly. Because if you can get an incentive system that forces rational players to behave honestly, you've taken somebody from, I want to make as much money as I can, to, I'm doing the right thing. And it's much more credible to believe you have all these people who are trying to make as much money as they can, to think you have a whole bunch of people who just want to do the right thing. So that's kind of the fun here.
So that means that if I'm an attacker and I have more CPU power, I can break the thing, or?
You can completely rewrite history, yeah, absolutely. Okay. I mean, so there's some nuance between what Bitcoin says it should do and what kind of Bitcoin does. So in theory, the simple summary for Bitcoin is whoever has the biggest proof of work, that's the correct history. There's just no argument. It's just like, so you could rewrite all of Bitcoin's history, and technically yours would now be the correct history because you have the biggest proof of work. Now, in reality, somebody would actually know because of the knowledge of history that you'd only come up with this now. That wasn't actually the correct one. There's some kind of nuance, but the security argument is the biggest proof of work is the correct history. And if you give me two alternative histories of Bitcoin, that's precisely how I should decide which one's correct. It's the one with the biggest proof of work. So what probably I suspect most of you don't know is that there's a general result. I just wrote MPC, I should have spelled out the acronym. It's multi-party computation. So you have multiple parties, they want to compute a function. There's a general result in multi-party computation that 2/3 of the players in the multi-party computation need to be honest. And if 2/3 of the people are not honest, at the very least, the adversary can halt the computation. So generally speaking, you need 2/3 honest or you just can't do anything. Blockchain, on the other hand, or Bitcoin in particular, aims at requiring that greater than half be rational. So you can see what blockchain is aiming for is actually a much, much weaker requirement than what you need in general. And the reason I want to point this out is the proof of work is fundamentally what allows that to happen. Without the proof of work in the blockchain, you're back to the normal result about you need 2/3 to be honest. And so when people say to you, the proof of work is so wasteful, I'm polluting the environment, it's terrible, we're burning all this electricity for nothing, which is all very true, they're going to lose a property by getting rid of the proof of work. It's actually fundamentally doing something in Bitcoin which is otherwise actually impossible. So there's a trade-off here, and there's no kind of have your cake and eat it too. So I think, as I said before, basically the way this works is that if you get two competing histories of Bitcoin, you take the one with the largest cumulative proof of work, and that's the correct one. And that's just kind of, I think actually the clients now have like hard-coded like checkpoints. But then, okay, maybe then if your client, you get a malicious client, then the malicious client will force you to accept the wrong history. So I mean, the clean security argument is to some extent nicer. So Bitcoin, I'm going to take the example about difficulty from Bitcoin at the moment because it's, I guess, the most impressive one. So I think, as probably most of you know, the difficulty target for Bitcoin is adjusted every 2 weeks, so the average block generation time is 10 minutes. And at the moment, there is 32 quintillion hashes occurring per second, which is about 2 to the 65. So this is roughly the number of animals currently alive on Earth, or the number of kilometers between us and the Andromeda galaxy. which is not like, it's not another star in our galaxy in the Milky Way, it's a different galaxy further away. So that's a big number. And as I said before, when I was talking about like how you define security, people used to say if you have 2 to the 80 computations, that's just impossible. Like nobody can do 2 to the 80 computations. Well, I mean, it's not doing 2 to the 80 every second, but it's getting rather close. So I think what's happened as a result of this is in many applications, people are actually going for, say, 2 to the 56 target bits of security. Part of that's got to do with what they think is going to happen when somebody finally builds a decent quantum computer. But still, you really want some nice bits of security. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about, that was the foundations. Now I'm going to talk about some things that Bitcoin is particularly, or blockchain in general is particularly good at. So one of the things that you may not have known is you have in sort of cryptography, about 40 years ago, you had all of this initial research on digital voting, digital cash, anonymous channels, all this kind of stuff really came out about the early 80s. And then after about 10 years of this stuff maturing, you started to see all kinds of startups happening, all kinds of people who knew fancy digital cash stuff who tried to actually make businesses out of it. And you've probably never heard of any of them. And there's a reason for that, which is they just didn't take off. And they were all using much fancier technology than Bitcoin was. So one of the questions you kind of should be asking is, why did Bitcoin get adopted when these other ones, which were kind of fancier, you know, nobody even remembers what they're called anymore? So part of the thing, I think, was that they had quite an initial bit of interest in the sort of early adapter community. Cyberpunk stuff was particularly kind of prominent at the period when Bitcoin released. And then Silk Road, I think. So my understanding is that about 1.2 billion US dollars of transactions were conducted in Bitcoin through the Silk Road network. Now, that's a nice amount of money to get pushed through your payment channel, and I think it really helped. Not necessarily the reputation of Bitcoin in some quarters, but the actual value of the currency. And of course, the other fun story from the early days of Bitcoin was the person who purchased 2 pizzas for 10,000 Bitcoins, which at the current exchange rate is 37 million euros per pizza. I mean, it's kind of, you know, nonsense. It's just about how much the currency has inflated since, but it's nevertheless amusing.
Domino's was the first pizza company which accepted Bitcoin as payment in the early years.
So I think the first case, the guy was living in Florida, and what actually happened was he paid somebody in the UK 10,000 Bitcoins. The guy in the UK called up the local pizza joint and got them to deliver to him, even though they were on different continents. So like, the actual pizzas were paid for with card, but sort of the person who paid for it with the card got recompensed with the Bitcoins. One of the fun stories in Australia, we have an organization who's responsible for basically finding out about new technology and informing the government. And so one of the guys in that organization found out about Bitcoin fairly early and mined Bitcoin fairly early. And when the Bitcoins got to about 4 euros, he sold out and made 20,000 euros. He was not unhappy to get 20,000 euros for basically the weekend. But of course, when he told me that story, the Bitcoin was about 1,000 euros. And you're kind of at that point going, okay. But I mean, there's this, you know, these stories are a dime a dozen. There's plenty of people who have either made or lost ridiculous amounts of money. But I think one of the things that encouraged people like myself to mine at one point was the ability to use existing hardware to mine. So, I mean, I made some money at one point by using my existing graphics cards to mine, and that kind of ability to use something you have to make money is obviously attractive. And then I think Bitcoin evolved into what is probably still its current main state, which is a hype machine. It's just kind of, it's Bitcoin because it's Bitcoin and because the market capitalization is absurdly high.
That's a good thing.
Sorry?
That's a good thing?
It's something Bitcoin is really good at.
Okay.
So when I say fortes, I mean something that Bitcoin is really good at, not something that's really good.
Okay.
Yeah. When I get to the bad things, I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to do the things that are really, Bitcoin is really bad at, not necessarily the things that are really bad. But anyway, so once its market capital reached about $1 billion US, it became the focus of Silicon Valleys and venture capitalists, and I think we're still basically in that stage based on the emails I get from people who are starting new cryptocurrencies with absurd amounts of backing. Yeah, so Bitcoin itself just became kind of like, I'm putting money into Bitcoin, I don't really know how it works, but I'm putting money into it because it's going up, and when it goes up, I'm going to make money. Not quite so good this year, but I think like start of last year, that was almost believable. It's also really interesting if you look at kind of, there's a lot of startups and a lot of research where they're saying we're doing blockchain research. And they're really not. They're doing almost anything, really. But I kind of knock that because I think it's ridiculous they're putting blockchain next to something which isn't got anything to do with blockchain. On the other hand, in many of those cases, particularly in academia, they're doing really interesting research in like formal programming verification or in legal aspects or in whatever the research they're doing. They're actually doing really interesting research. It's just they would have done pretty much the same research without blockchain. But I guess this way they're getting more grant funding. So it's kind of interesting. That's maybe actually something good about the hype machine of Bitcoin. It's got a lot more funding towards things in cryptography and towards some other research fields that might have otherwise not got that money. So I think the other thing is Bitcoin arrived at a really interesting time. So it came out at the start of 2009, which is pretty much banging the global financial crisis. And as some of you may know, the Genesis block of Bitcoin contains a message, and the message, I think, says, "The Times Chancellor announces new bailout for the banks," or something. So this is a reference to a newspaper, a London newspaper article at the time, where there was going to be a second round of bailout money to the banks. And so we're going, okay, these banks actually, this sort of existing financial infrastructure doesn't seem to actually be behaving itself very well. Maybe we can decentralize it and distribute it and have kind of enforced rules. And it opened up the way for people to trade domestically, internationally, independent of the standard regulatory bodies. So I think when WikiLeaks was trying to basically shut down WikiLeaks by getting MasterCard and Visa to stop sending the money through, you can obviously use Bitcoin, they can't stop that. I think in Australia, one of the prominent examples of groups that use Bitcoin is actually the immigrants from China. At least at some points in the past, it's been very hard to get your money out of China. The government sort of like, no, you're keeping your money in the country. But if you convert into Bitcoins, then they can't really stop you moving it wherever you want. But what I think excites me most about the blockchain stuff, and where I think I'm still looking forward to seeing some really interesting things, is the idea of treating blockchain as a distributed virtual machine. So if you have sufficiently expressive contracts, as you have in a number of languages, you can allow the blockchain to encode and then enforce contracts with a monetary penalty. So it's kind of, the blockchain is at this point somewhat acting like a distributed virtual machine, somewhat acting like a court in the sense that there's a contract between us, and if either of us can provide evidence the other party misbehaved, then it'll enforce a penalty on us. And I'm particularly interested about this stuff when you combine it with formally verified programs. So what you can do with a program, if you want, you can actually define what it means for the program to be correct under some definition of correctness, and then you can show that that program actually meets the specification. I mean, it's not easy, but you can do it. But then one of the questions, of course, is, okay, so your program with respect to like the specification of the language does what you meant it to do, but what if the hardware is corrupted, or what's happening here? So if you actually believe that these blockchains are sensibly distributed virtual machines, then you have code that you know what it was supposed to do when you've shown that it does that, running on something which should be much harder to compromise than individual hardware. Fictions. So I put a number of things in this section that are kind of loosely related, but I think I'm going to talk about some of the things that blockchain is not as good at. But first, an aside. If you wanted to break Bitcoin, or you wanted to break another one of these cryptocurrencies and become fabulously wealthy, what would you have to do? What's the attack? So there's two classes of attacks. The one on the left, forging transactions, is the unethical and illegal class of attack. That's stealing people's money. The one on the right is a perfectly legal way of making large amounts of money if you can do it. So as I said before, Bitcoin for its authentication uses these digital signatures. In particular, it uses something called the elliptic curve digital signature algorithm. So if you can break that signature, you can basically break the authentication mechanism. So the first thing you could try and do is the signature is based on a problem called the discrete log problem on elliptic curves, which at the moment we believe to be a really hard problem. There's basically no way to break that better than brute force. But if you become a mathematical super genius, you can figure out a better way to do it. Yep?
Quick question. I thought the elliptic curve cryptography was exactly invented because of being quantum computer.
No. There are isogeny curves, which are post-quantum, but elliptic curves, no.
Okay.
They're, so for those of, just maybe an aside, most of cryptography is that's actually currently in use, which is public key cryptography, the sort of the asymmetric stuff, is based on one of two problems. It's either factorization or discrete log. Both of these problems are in a group of problems called the hidden subgroup problem, and there's an algorithm for quantum computers which exactly solves that problem in polynomial time. So if it's discrete log based or it's factorization based, the moment somebody actually manages to build a sufficiently large and expressive quantum computer, crypto is useless basically. And in particular, so it's kind of fun in Bitcoin. When I said the address that you send money to is a public key, that's technically false. The address is the hash of the public key. And the digital signature stuff, like if I know your public key for Bitcoin and I have this sufficiently large quantum computer, I can just recover your private key, and then I can take all your money. However, if all you give me is the hash of the hash of the public key, then I probably can't do it unless it's a really, really fast. But basically, hash functions, as we construct them, are post-quantum. They will hold against somebody with a quantum computer. It's just the signatures that won't. So if you only use your keys once in Bitcoin, it's basically fine. You're fine to use your keys once, but if you use your keys twice, then when somebody gets a quantum computer, they break it.
But wait, you need to verify,
yeah.
You need to know the public key.
Yeah, so when you verify, you release the public key, but if you only use it once, when you release that public key is exactly when you spend, and then you've already spent the money, so there's no longer any money there. It's kind of an interesting argument. It's outside of what we'd normally call a security argument, because basically you're using things that are broken, but if you narrow the attack window to 10 minutes, the idea is, well, they can't actually mount the attack in the 10-minute window. It's better than nothing, but I would still suggest that the cryptocurrency should move to properly, we call it post-quantum crypto, that is still secure against the quantum adversary. They should move at some point, but I don't think Bitcoin is going to find it very easy to change.
The interesting thing is that the Bitcoin hash rate is so high, if you could use that compute power, which is very specific, but if you could use that compute power, you could easily break most of the public keys. If you had that compute power.
No, not with classical algorithms. So the field they're working on is 256 bits of information. So the discrete log problem in that field is about 128 bits of security. So it's 65. Yeah, 65 is.
A long way away.
Yeah, it's about the distance between here and Andromeda again. Yeah, yeah. So it's.
I'm not mentioning that the specific hardware is specific for hashes.
Yeah.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah, but okay, that's a different thing. And then if you break one signature.
Yeah, they're not great. It's not really a super win. Unless you find somebody who's got a lot of money on that. Depends on the public key.
But there are some known public keys in Bitcoin with an awful lot of money on them. So if you could break those keys, people would probably get very suspicious. Oh, did I? No, I'm still good. Okay. So yeah, basically because of the way people use Bitcoin rather than an inherent vulnerability in the protocol, if you did have a sufficiently large quantum computer, you could basically take a lot of the money, because a lot of people reuse their public keys for multiple transactions, and this invalidates the kind of crazy post-quantum resistance it had. Another way to make money, and actually sort of legally, would be to mine faster. So the cryptographic puzzles I talked about earlier are basically based on the pseudo-randomness or the partial preimage resistance of the hash function called SHA-256. So if you could discover a way to generate messages that were more likely to result in a particular output distribution in SHA-256, then you would get a speed up in calculating the function. Whether that speed up depends how good that distribution you found was compared to just how efficient the hardware they have for this is now. Or you could just design more efficient hardware. But there are various ways to mine faster, which create interesting properties. There was at some point some ideas in the community to change the way the proof of work worked in Bitcoin so that it did something useful. My personal favorite for this was something called DDoS coin, where you got paid money for DDoSing a given website, and each block you got to designate which DDoS had to happen for the next block. It works wonderfully as an incentive system. I hope nobody ever actually gets it going and deployed because I don't want the DDoS. But in general, it's really hard to find problems which are interesting, which have this kind of pseudo-random output. It seems like you kind of need a made-up function.
By interesting, you mean useful?
Yeah, useful. So it's like, you know, you might want to find, say, like some primes with certain properties was an example a lot of people have run with. Kind of works. Okay, so now like things that are actually bad about Bitcoin rather than just about how you could break it. So one is scalability. So the average cost, at least when I looked was it March, to process a Bitcoin transaction is actually $80 US, which is obviously far too much money for a lot of transactions you want to do.
For pizza, even 2 pizzas.
Yeah, you could actually get pizzas. Yeah, so however, the submitter, the person who uploads the transaction, only pays about 1% of this, and they basically print new money and inflate the currency to pay for the rest of it. But that printing of new money is being wound down in the case of Bitcoin, so at some point, this cost is actually going to come back on the people who are using the system, or the whole economics are going to change. Also, the current theoretical transaction load is 10 transactions per second. I should have put on this slide how many like Visa and MasterCard do per second, but it's orders of magnitude and orders of magnitude greater. Yeah. Now, you could actually increase this transaction load by either making the blocks bigger or reducing the block interval. However, in either case, you actually wreck the security. And there's the reason this is actually quite simple. If you look at the kind of the proof that Bitcoin actually, like the incentive systems work that I talked about earlier, the proof says that the time that it takes me to tell you about my new block is negligible, is basically minute, is of no consequence in the amount of time between blocks. So basically you hear instantaneously about each new block. Now even at the moment in Bitcoin that's not true. It takes about 15 seconds to reach network propagation, and it's only about 10 minutes between blocks. So it's 1 in 40. It's fairly small, but it's by no means negligible. But when you move to Ethereum and a lot of the other coins and altcoins, which have lowered the block interval to try and make it more responsive, they're really in trouble in terms of the security argument actually working, because now the time to propagate is a quarter or a half of the time between blocks. And I think what that means in practice, it hasn't really been tested on any major coin. What that means in practice is you wouldn't need 50% of the power to break Ethereum. You would probably only need 33% or 25%. There's some much smaller percentage you need, because you can do interesting things about people's incomplete knowledge, and you can get them mining on the wrong thing and basically have fun with the fact they don't know what's happened yet. Though I should say those attacks I just talked about, where you exploit less than 50% to make more money, are actually, interestingly, really public with these cryptocurrencies. If anybody actually does those attacks, you can look at the blocks that are being produced and go, oh, the attack is happening. Because the intervals between the blocks, like how close the blocks are, becomes very different when that attack is happening to when it's not happening. Basically, if somebody mounts a 33% attack on Bitcoin, What they do to do that is they basically mine a block, but they don't tell anybody about the block they just mined until the next one's produced. Then they quickly propagate their new block, and basically they've already started working on the block after the block they just got propagated, so they get an advantage. But if you do that, what you're going to see happening on the public history is all of these two blocks everybody found about really close together. And where with normal probability distributions, they should be spaced fairly uniformly across 10 minutes. So they really, people got really excited about these attacks a few years ago. They're kind of cute attacks, but one of the things that makes them less interesting is if they're happening, you really see that they're happening. And in particular, you look at the moment and go,
you invest in this attack and then essentially devalue the Bitcoin by causing a panic.
Yeah. And you can also look and just see they're not happening. You can just look at Bitcoin and go, okay, nobody has actually really mounted anything that amounts to a 33% attack. Interestingly, with Bitcoin, at various points in its history, there have been individual parties with more than 50% of the hash rate. And they have split their mining pools in two to stop being this because it looks bad. But these mining pools have all the interest in the world in Bitcoin staying considered to be secure and considered to be valuable. So the pragmatic point of making the currency look secure so that you don't devalue all these assets you produce for yourself is actually what's securing it, not the fact that it's actually properly decentralized. But hey, they'll take what they can get, right?
Which somehow comes closer to the proof of stake than proof of work in a sense.
Yeah, but I don't like...
You simply invested so much that you don't have to break it.
And I think this is where they go to for proof of stake. I don't like it, and the reason I don't like it is from what I talked about before. So I said before, if you give me two alternative histories for Bitcoin, I just tell you which one's correct. I just count the proof of work and I verify them. If you give me two proof of stake-based currencies, I'm not sure exactly how they're going to implement these, but my intuition is basically you could rewrite history in proof of stake. And it's certainly not as clear which is the real history as it would be in proof of work. That being said, I'd want to actually evaluate any individual scheme on its merits, but I'd be interested to see if anybody could do proof of stake really nicely, because it should, I think, hit that impossibility result I talked about when I was talking about proof of work. So I said before, decentralization was one of the strengths of Bitcoin, but centralization is one of its weaknesses. So while Bitcoin is supposed to be decentralized, it's really, really, really not. There are a very small number of mining pools which control almost all of the computational power. And I'll say why that is in a second. But first, just another point. I find private blockchains hilarious, or non-decentralized blockchains hilarious, and the reason for that is all the crypto in, say, Bitcoin has been around for 40 years. And for 30 of those years, we got away with calling that something and not blockchain. So why have we suddenly renamed it? I'm not saying you shouldn't use hash functions, I'm not saying you shouldn't use signatures, I'm not saying you shouldn't use fancy crypto. I just don't think that's what blockchain is. Obviously though, Microsoft and Amazon and everybody else who has their boot up your own blockchain systems or whatever they're running would like to disagree with me and like that to be blockchain. So I appreciate that I'm in a kind of a weird subset, but I just want the name to mean something other than what we had other words for 30 years.
I think the only difference with state there is the public thing. So with blockchain, you can use it, or with a centralized blockchain, you can still do it publicly, that everyone can validate that something was signed by the right quotation marks party. Yeah.
Yeah, I still don't want to call it blockchain.
I'm perfectly fine with that.
There's no proof of work, and that whole kind of argument about rational parties behaving honestly doesn't apply. And so I mean,
let's call that digital signature, right?
Yeah.
I think the most like they use it to just to raise the money, like marketing.
Yeah. But, okay, so there's the aside finished. Talk about the big cryptocurrencies. So they're actually really not very decentralized. And there's a really good reason why the big cryptocurrency is not very decentralized. And there's actually a problem with the incentive mechanism. So the incentive mechanism in Bitcoin is, for a given block, there is a party who gets all of the money. And everybody else who tried to mine and in a sense contributed to security in that block gets nothing. And so let's say I have 1,000th, 1/1,000% or amount of the mining power for Bitcoin. So that's a lot of mining power. And my average rate of return is not actually that bad. But the time it takes for me to actually get any money back is actually quite large. So basically what it is, it's a high stakes lottery. You mine and you're buying tickets, and your tickets will win with some probability. And of course this is completely unacceptable for almost any kind of people. So what you do is you form mining pools, and then we basically average out the lottery and we reduce the standard deviation. We still have the same expected rate of return, and it's better. It's a better way of making money. However, the problem is now we have, instead of all of these little parties doing individual verification, we have a couple of big mining pools. And in particular, and a lot of these currencies, it only takes 2 or 3 mining pools to get more than 50%. And you can find 2 or 3 mining pools which are located in, shall we say, countries where the government wanted to make Bitcoin or make the cryptocurrency do a particular thing. The government would make the currency do a particular thing. So in particular, even if it was feasible, I wouldn't recommend that any government try and do any kind of, say, voting on the cryptocurrency or anything that's sort of critical for national security on any cryptocurrency, only the public ones, because if you make it worth enough, I suspect you will actually convince them that it's worth their while to do something. So this is one of the ongoing research problems for Bitcoin, is how do you actually decentralize it in a better way? So, future directions. So, I haven't got a lot of stuff written on the slide, but I have a fair bit to talk about. So one of the real problems with Bitcoin is anonymity. So as I said earlier, there was a fair bit of activity which wanted to be anonymous on Bitcoin in the first few years. And they weren't really. They got traced by the FBI. They got, they didn't work for them at all. I think it didn't take too long for various law enforcement agencies to get really good at going, okay, you have these names on these exchanges, do the trace through the network, basically. Maybe there's a little bit of mixing, but even when there was some kind of mixing of coins to try and get some more anonymity, it was people who had money, they wanted to be anonymized, mixing people who had money, they wanted to be anonymized. Both of the coins were often dirty anyway, so it's still like, it didn't really help. So there were, I think, the two better known contenders for having better anonymity at this stage are Zcash and Monero. And Monero is where most of the people who were using Bitcoin who wanted to be anonymous went first. I think they may have moved on since, but at least at one point it was doing really well out of that particular market. And so both of these systems work using the same kind of technology. And it's called zero knowledge. And it's fun to explain. People have lots of stories, and they have cards, and they have like things they can, and props to try and explain this. But the premise is basically this. Let's say I want to convince you of a statement. And here's my statement. My statement is, I am somebody who has a certain amount of money. I am trying to send that amount of money to this other person. And so obviously, so that's my statement. Like I have, like whatever you think you need for the transaction to be considered correct. They have enough money. The amount of money they're spending is the same amount of money. The inputs add up to the outputs. Whatever you want it to be. And in the first basic story I gave you, how that worked is I said, I am Alice, and I want to pay Bob 3 units. And then you can just check. You can trivially check that that's true. But obviously, when I say that Alice wants to pay Bob 3 units, I've told you something more than the fact that there is somebody who has the amount of money who wants to give to somebody else, and the amount of money adds up. I've told you exactly who the people are and how much money it is. So the technique of zero knowledge is basically this. You have a statement you want to prove, and you prove that that statement is true, and you show nothing else. You reveal no information other than the statement is true. So I particularly prove that I am somebody who has the amount of money, I haven't spent the money before, I want to send it to this person, and the amounts add up. So I prove that that is in fact true, all the correctness things are true, but I reveal no other information.
But isn't it that I have to know the stuff that I want to pay money to commerce, and so I'm the platform which handles this, so I have the knowledge about it. So
Can you state the question?
I understand that the thing is that to transfer the money, it has to be only true that I have enough money and I gave it to him, but somebody has to know that I have enough money and that he received it.
No. So this is something that got originally. This has been a cryptographic technique for about 30 years because apparently everything in cryptography was invented in the 1980s. And we have like students doing cryptography classes at uni, and you teach them about this for like 4 hours in a lecture and they don't understand what you just said because it's kind of mind-boggling. But no, it is literally just that. You have some kind of definition, some statement, you prove that statement and nothing else, and you can have statements that just say, I am somebody who had the money and I'm transferring it and the outputs equal the inputs, and you won't reveal who you were. You can't double spend, but you can't reveal who you were. I guess this talk is about blockchain and not zero knowledge, so I kind of put this slide in here because this is a lot of stuff that people are really interested in, but I could have given the 2-hour talk on zero knowledge. So Monero uses something that's called a linkable ring signature. That's how it works. And basically this is just a signature scheme. And this signature scheme, you have a list of basically public keys. And your signature says, I have the secret key for one of those public keys, but I don't tell you which of the public keys I have the secret key for. And they've got some fancier stuff to show that the balances end up equaling out. But basically, you say, I am one of the people with, effectively, people who have money. The signatures prevents you signing twice, so you can't double spend, and it works. Zcash uses much fancier stuff called zero knowledge, succinct, non-interactive arguments of knowledge, which are really compact, really easy to verify, quite hard to generate. I won't go into how they work. But that's to say there are these really interesting cryptographic techniques about anonymity which really do work and really give you actually perfect privacy. So for instance, in Zcash, if you could compute, if you had infinite computational power, now of course you can, in a finite universe you can't have infinite computational power, but even if you had infinite computational power, you would still not break privacy in Zcash. You would still have no idea who was paying whom. You could forge as many transactions as you want in Zcash with infinite computational power, and the same in Monero. You could like steal all the money, but you wouldn't break privacy. So you'd break integrity, but not privacy. And that's basically how most of these things work. Yeah, it's a trade-off between the two, but in general, privacy I care about into the future, and integrity I only care about in a much shorter time frame. But you can still put the parameters high enough that unless we misunderstand maths and sort of the nature of the universe, nobody will actually be able to ever break the security. One of the interesting questions that's still open here is how do you balance regulatory and privacy tensions? So at least for me, and I appreciate now I'm starting to get into like more of policy and politics than technical stuff, there is transactions which people want to do which I am perfectly fine with the government stopping. And most of these are around child exploitation or this kind of thing where you have a lot of harm being done. But at the same time, outside of those cases, I want the government to know nothing, basically. I don't think there's any use, except of course in the case of I think there is use. And how in the world do you balance those two in these kind of privacy mechanisms, which even if you have unlimited computational power, you can't break the privacy? There's some kind of open questions here. And there's various people who've made suggestions. But it'll be interesting to see what happens. Okay, so one of the other things I think is going to be interesting to see in the future is that kind of Turing-complete distributed virtual machine. It's still really developing. There's lots of interesting applications of these more complicated sort of universal computation blockchains that haven't really emerged. And I'm looking forward to seeing them happen. So one of the difficulties in writing these scripts, if you've ever had a go at writing Ethereum scripts and doing stuff that you want privacy for, it's really hard because it's on the public blockchain. All the inputs are public, all the computation is public, all the outputs are public. Now it turns out that using other cryptographic techniques, you can have really good privacy, even though all the computation is public and all the inputs and outputs are public. You use things called homomorphic encryption, where you basically submit encrypted data, you do all your operations on the encrypted data, and you have ciphertexts come out the other end, which are basically some function of the messages in the input ciphertexts. Once again, I won't go into how this works, but that's something we actually did for the company I work at. We did some stuff where we basically counted ballots, election ballots, and all the ballots were basically counted and tallied by Ethereum. But because they were encrypted and the output was encrypted, you could see that they were tallied correctly, but you had no idea what any of the votes were. So these are kind of fun games to play. However, the issue with these sort of fancier contracts is it's harder to see that what you did is correct. And I think Ethereum also gives the best example of this, because it is still hard forked as a result of the DOE project collapse. So for those of you who don't know, there was this contract on Ethereum, and the idea of the contract was vaguely as follows. You put your money into the contract, and you get voting rights in the contract proportional to your the amount of money you put in. And then the contract, or this pot of money, makes investments and gets a return on those investments, and the choice of investments is directed by the people voting. And then you can take your money out. So sort of a distributed vessel for investment. I may be butchering it slightly, but that's vaguely the idea. However, there was a slight problem. The script to withdraw money didn't actually require that you had put that much money in. And somebody discovered this and took out some absurd amount of money. And the Ethereum sort of developer community said, no, this is not good. We're going to roll back Ethereum so that didn't happen and people keep their money. Now this is nice. You don't want people losing their money. On the other hand, this is supposed to be like a decentralized system. It wasn't supposed to be there was this group of people who could say, no, we're just going to revert history now. And so you have Ethereum Classic, which is traded on the exchanges, and you have Ethereum. And Ethereum Classic is the group of people who said, no, we're not going to roll back history just because somebody made a typo or mistake in the script they created. There's also the problem if you have these kind of irreversible systems. You want to be really sure that what you did is what you meant to do, because that's what you're going to be stuck with. So in particular, you just have stupid things. So for instance, one of the ones, I made a mistake actually. I was writing some code for Ethereum, and I made a mistake. I had a padding error in my code, and my padding error code was like 1 in 256 probability or something. And I felt a bit stupid because it would occasionally break, and I was like, what's happening? But then I found out something, and I was much happier. I found out that there is sort of official tooling that Ethereum provides, or that is provided that you can use for Ethereum, to make web clients. And this tooling that they provide to make the clients had exactly the same error that I made. Except when they made it, what actually happened was the private key you got didn't match the public key you got. So you got this public key, you put it there, you pay money to get all the money sent to your public key, and then you find out your private key doesn't work for that public key, and you've just lost all that money. And there's all, you go and look online if you want, there was all these really angry posts to the client developers, like the wallet developers, even though it wasn't their fault. It was a library they were using rather than their code itself, and people lost all this money. And I'm going, okay, be careful that your code does what you want, because if it doesn't, in this case, you're going to irreversibly lose large amounts of money. It's also quite hard to make these more too incomplete languages decentralized, even harder than it is normally.
Does that go back to what you said right at the beginning about provably correct programs? Or?
And you will notice this now, if you've had anything to do with Ethereum since this happened, they are really into provably correct programs now. They have and there's all this tooling about verifying your contracts and all this stuff. And the reason is quite simple. they have like nightmares still basically about this, and there's a lot of focus on it. Yeah.
Isn't there a fork of Bitcoin too?
Yeah. Yes. There are forks of almost everything. So I think, so in general, with programming languages, for instance, what you see happening is if a language gets enough adoption, yeah. It makes it harder for the language to evolve and make changes that break backwards compatibility. This is true of programming languages. It's even more true of cryptocurrencies. Once it's got enough adoption, you have to have a consensus to change, and good luck, basically, getting that consensus. So for instance, with Bitcoin, they really struggle to get consensus for changes, and every time they want to make a change, you just get a hard fork, because some people go one way and some people go the other way. And this is one of the reasons why my bet at the moment is that Bitcoin will probably die, basically, at some point. It has too much inability to change, and it was invented too early along. There were too many kind of things that it was really good, but I mean, there were still too many things that we found out since about how you should do things differently. But you see particular focus in some of the newer blockchains to try and be more centralized so that you can update the protocol and you can change things without just splitting the currency every time.
Can you give us an example for what you say in your idea? It's like it will be more than Bitcoin, like using blockchain.
What will become the new Bitcoin?
Yeah, in your mind.
Well, I mean, just by market capitalization at the moment, one would have to say Ethereum, I think.
Yeah,
but there are, yeah, I'm interested to see. So what actually has happened, and I will talk about this now actually, is what I think should be the new one, even though it hasn't actually been released yet, to the best of my knowledge. And that's about scalability. Because for me, scalability is the absolute problem with public blockchains. Like, I love the idea, but if it doesn't scale, it doesn't scale. And the idea that you have lots of these different ones running, it just undermines the security. If blockchain is going to do kind of what I want it to do, I want there to be one blockchain that everybody is working to secure, and all of the transactions are secured by that blockchain. Now, obviously, that's kind of an idea that's hard to make work. So here are two ways that you could go about trying to increase scalability in blockchain. So the first one that's been really popular for probably, I think, 2 years now is the microtransaction channels. And basically the idea is that we use a smart contract to securely condense many real-world transactions into a single, or normally two actually, transactions on the real blockchain. So the idea is basically that we put a transaction on the blockchain that establishes a line of credit between, say, me and Tomasz. And now we can sort of update the balance of our line of credit, and only when we're both happy, only when we're sort of finished doing our transactions do we update the blockchain about the new status. However, if either of us is unhappy with what the other one does at some point, you basically create save points along the way, and you can always revert to the most recent save point by going back to the blockchain. So you basically secure a whole bunch of transactions with two transactions on the blockchain. But then when you get to things like a Lightning Network is the famous one for Bitcoin, well, I can't really have a line of credit with all of you. That just doesn't make sense. There's just be too many transactions. But let's say I have, say, the line of credit with Tomasz, and he has a line of credit with Achim. Basically, the network allows me to pay Achim by paying Tomasz, who then pays Achim. So you route your payment through a bunch of people who all have these sort of one-to-one channels. It's a really nice idea. You can condense a lot of transactions. You can really increase the throughput. However, the issue is we both kind of have to commit at the start to how much money is in this line of credit between us. And that's fixed. So if you have somebody who's living week to week, like they would have to do a new transaction every week or something, because they don't have the money to put on for longer than a week. And so you get some advantage, but it's really not enough, basically, to condense it. But still, it would be, I think, you would probably use this along with other techniques, because it's kind of free almost, and you just condense so many transactions. So the one that I'm particularly interested in to see come out in terms of new cryptocurrencies are graph-based approaches. So starting probably 3 years ago now in the academic community, people started to go, okay, in Bitcoin I have one block and then one block and then one block and one block, and you can't make the blocks closer together or bigger because of the reasons I talked about earlier. But we have more complicated structures than just like a line of blocks. Can we use those and still make it work? And so in particular, there's a structure called a DAG, which is a directed acyclic graph. So basically it's a graph that goes from like the past into the future, and there's no cycles. And if you arrange your transactions like that, what happens is that in the past, you end up with basically like you have at the moment in Bitcoin. You have basically just a static history, like this transaction happened and this one happened and so on. But at the present, in the sort of really close time period, it's messier than that. Like it solidifies to a sort of a total ordering over all transactions, but it's messier at the front. And that messiness at the front allows you to just have a lot more transactions. There's no block intervals, it's just when people put transactions. And then it condenses there. And then, of course, you have to show this is actually secure under the arguments, etc. But that's basically been done. It's as I say, it's been about 3 years people have been working on this. They're pretty mature in terms of the arguments. To the best of my knowledge, no, there is only one cryptocurrency that actually uses a graph-based approach that's sort of well known, and that is called IOTA. And at least when I last looked, there's no security there at all, basically. They have no security arguments. Like, everybody's just honest, which is somehow less than ideal. To me, I think you want to have a good security argument. So I think this graph-based approach has really good potential for decentralizing, for increasing scalability. But as I say, at the moment, at least I think it was halfway through this year that I last had a real look, there's not really anybody who's actually developed and released something that does this, because there are problems in sort of how you do it. So one of the issues with these at the moment is these graph-based approaches don't care what the payload is. That you can use whatever kind of payload you want, like whatever kind of transactions you want. The graph-based approaches are happy with that. However, your transactions may not be happy with graph-based approaches. So in particular, because that front thing is kind of messy, you can do things that seem weird. So for instance, I can see a transaction has occurred, it's been added and confirmed, and I can now create a new transaction and post it, which once the history settles, will be viewed as having occurred before the transaction that I posted in response to. So you can imagine all kinds of contracts you could write where the ability to see something has happened and then make something happen before it isn't a great idea. There's lots and lots of transactions which actually don't care about that, because the new transaction is deemed invalid because the network already knows about the newer one or the older one. But anyway, it's still just kind of complicated, and exactly what transactions work and what don't still needs to be worked out. So we're at the end. So questions?
Are there any fundamental considerations that say some of the good properties you might want of a future blockchain currency are mutually exclusive? Like, you can't have anonymity and scaling to certain degrees, and you can't have other properties, or is there's nothing really known about that everybody's trying to mix and match as much and get as many good properties as they can get?
I don't think I've read very much at all about impossibility results, or like incompatible results in Bitcoin. I think the scalability and privacy example is one where there isn't any real incompatibility. The cost, they're really, really good privacy techniques where it's really small, like what your output is really small and really cheap to verify. So small and so cheap to verify, it would be, I mean, it's larger than just having it plainly visible, but not a lot.
So the future is fairly golden in that you can mix and match and get better and better blockchains that have more and more better properties, hopefully, as long as your brain power is enough to consider them.
I want to walk back what I just said slightly. The microtransaction channels, they don't play nice with privacy, at least the ones that I've seen. Yeah, I think the future is really still very interesting. There's still a lot of things that you can do which people haven't really done yet. And I'm interested to see. Yeah, I mean, I think for me, a lot of the initial stuff was kind of uninteresting in crypto. So you had obviously Bitcoin came out, Bitcoin became really well known, and then you had all these altcoins get spun off. But a lot of those altcoins were like, we take the Bitcoin code, we change that parameter, and we have our altcoin, and we change the image. Or in some cases it was slightly better than that. It was we switch out the proof of work system for another proof of work system, but it's still basically it's Bitcoin with a different proof of work system. So there was a long time where at least what was happening in the coins or in the blockchains was kind of really boring, and we're still it's got a lot better, but it's still a lot of things that people don't really seem to be playing with yet.
So I'm not sure if I got the right takeaway. So is there an alternative to the proof of work, or if you want decentralization, or it's only to do some useful proof of work?
Okay, so with the graph-based approaches, you still do proof of work. It's just because instead of having these big monolithic blocks, you have all these little things happening. It's still a lottery, but it's got a much smaller standard deviation. It's got a much more regular payout, so it doesn't incentivize the kind of centralization that you see with Bitcoin and Ethereum and all the current ones. The other thing that people talk about sometimes is called proof of space. You may have heard about proof of space. Basically, the idea is you show you've committed a certain amount of hard drive space, and that's your proof. It's much less energy intensive. A proof of space is actually a proof of work. It's a computational problem where the amount of space you have dedicated to trying to solve the problem type of storage is more important than the amount of CPU cycles you spend. But it's still fundamentally a computational problem. And you can have no storage and just use an awful lot of CPU power and you still solve them. I think that's interesting. I think the proof of space stuff has a lot nicer properties than Bitcoin in terms of like not just releasing so much CO2 into the atmosphere, while still having kind of the good properties of actually being a cryptographic puzzle.
And the research on this is supported by the producers of hard drives, I guess.
Yes, well, I don't know if they got sponsored by Seagate, but they really should have because...
Which currency uses this proof of space?
That is a good question. None that I know of.
There was one, but I don't know what it's called.
Yeah, I'm sure there is because it's been around for a while, but yeah, none of the major ones use it. Yeah. Okay, maybe it's...
Another one. Is there then a lot of work going on in provably correct programs? Because I know back in the 80s when I worked, there was a lot, and then it was kind of, well, yeah, nobody's interested apart from in hardware where it costs a lot to build a new chip, and so we'll prove that my chip design is correct. But sort of really provably correct programming there wasn't very much going on for a long time. Does that mean that there's more in that direction being, from all this money pot coming around for I've got a coin and therefore I'm programming and then I really need the correct programming?
There certainly is. A lot of what they're doing is not actually provably correct stuff. It's kind of like code analysis stuff, basically. Like you kind of have
static
tools.
Code.
Yeah, I'm not sure how all these tools work, but there's an enormous number of them for particularly Ethereum. But I think generally, I mean, I work in a fairly specific area, and in that area where you want to do stuff with elections, it's nice if certain parts of the code do what you thought it was going to do. So particularly, I come from Australia, and in Australia we have a really complicated way to count ballots. And the Electoral Commission software to count the ballots is normally wrong. So for instance, in the Capital Territory, I think 3 times in the last 3 years, somebody's gone to them and said, this part of your code is wrong. It's not actually legally how you're supposed to count the ballots. That kind of thing is a case where the formally verified stuff is being worked on, because it's nice if you elect the person who the law says you are supposed to elect. But I think obviously that's kind of a fairly simple algorithm. Like you have these well-defined list of inputs, you have kind of some well-defined function. It's much easier than many other programs you might want to verify.
You might measure that typically contracts are not that big.
Yeah, so I think it's also the contracts are fairly small in Ethereum, which helps. I think the other thing is once you start thinking about the formal verification, it actually changes how you write the code in the first place. And that often is actually quite useful. You write much more declarative, I think.
Yeah. No, you used to know a lot of people worked in that field in research. They all moved into doing hardware.
Are there any ideas like when Bitcoin hit it last year really high, there are a lot of people in China building mining farms and stuff like this, and like a single person like me can't afford like big mining farms. Is there any movement like to work against those people? Because they have a lot of CPU power, especially the CPUs which are built especially for mining Bitcoins, and I can't, as a private person, I can't afford those.
Yeah, I mean this is the question people start arguing about which proof of work you should use, because the problem with the proof of work they use in Bitcoin is you can make these devices that are so optimized for it that if you don't have these devices, you're meaningless. You have various other solutions which people use where, for instance, graphics cards are still actually competitive because it's much harder to design dedicated hardware. I think for me, the kind of stuff that I've worked on, you just say, you have a proof of work system, and then it works, and you leave up to the people who implement it to choose one. But it is, I think, hard to choose a good proof of work that is better for decentralization. Actually, one of my concerns about proof of space at one point is the NSA has much better storage than anybody else by several orders of magnitude. And they would hence be much, much better at these puzzles than anybody else by several orders of magnitude. So it's hard to, you want to choose something where there's a somewhat level playing field. And yeah, it's not easy.
Yeah. What I think is funny that the embedding of contracts which need to be formally verified is also some kind of centralization, because then it centralizes on people who will be able to prove these contracts to be correct.
So I guess the hope might be that the way in which you prove them to correct is much easier to verify than it is.
Yeah.
And you can just take somebody else's contract and run it yourself. Like, I mean, any contract you see on Ethereum, you can just duplicate.
Yeah, so I'm not really hopeful in this area.
Okay.
Given all the ifs and buts and, trust and whatever, why do people trust coins? Because there's so many open questions, and instability in the networks, not really decentralized systems.
So I think there is some kind of proof of stake argument here where these currencies, the people who have the power in these currencies have a lot of money in these currencies, and if they ever actually did anything, it would be public, and it would lose all the trust, and they'd lose large amounts of money. So the rationality here is not the rationality about the incentive system. The point, yeah. The rationality is about you're not going to kill the duck that lays the golden eggs, even if you could get some value out of killing the duck. You just keep. But also, like you somehow you lose all of the golden eggs you've ever produced if you kill the duck now. So I mean, it's. I find it strange how resistant. How secure in practice some of these currencies have been, considering that they're fairly easy for certain people to attack if they wanted to. But I suspect it may also be the sort of standard security argument. I mean, there are plenty of attacks on SCADA systems that would shut down power plants and break dams, etc. Why aren't power plants and dams going down? The people with these attacks are hoarding them for when, if there's a war or something, it's kind of the standard kind of, if you have the ability to cause a lot of damage, you save it for an opportune moment. You don't just, but yeah, I think they shouldn't, to some extent they shouldn't trust them as much as they do, because if you get into a situation where they actually have an interest in shutting them down and breaking them, they will be broken.
Yeah, but also I think that there is something more realistic in the short term, more realistic risk, which is the speculative nature. So I think this is something that can hit you bad, quite likely, as opposed to like somebody breaks the system.
I think that was kind of what happened with Bitcoin Cash, is when the realization that not just that the system has to be secured, the system has to actually work for it to be useful. And the Bitcoin Cash fork showed that there was a possibility of people stopping the system from working. And therefore people said, well, I'm not going to put money into something where, yeah, it might be secure, but I can't do anything with it. The system can't actually process transactions anymore. And that's an easier thing to break without, from the outside, you know, even if you don't have an investment in the system.
I'm not familiar with the Bitcoin Cash system overlay. Is it actually proof of work based?
Yeah, it's basically just another Bitcoin fork. But the problem was that when they went for a fork, one side said, well, what we'll do is we'll destroy the hashing mechanism for you, I'll destructively hash and put empty blocks on. Therefore, the system would be the other person's system would be broken by an adversary. And this concept of an adversarial rather than just cheating comes to break another system, and therefore it's lost trust.
Yep. The proliferation of altcoins is terrifying. In the sense that the whole point here was you wanted to have a lot of people working on one thing to make it secure. The moment you split that up, and particularly when they're using the same proof of work based system, and you have like a bigger currency using that same proof of work and a smaller currency, the miners can switch whenever they want to the one they don't like. And yeah, exactly. The concept of the altcoins obviously is fun to make your own currency and to do the things, but from a security point of view, it's kind of, unless you have enough people buying into it, that it's going to stay honest, it's kind of useless. Okay. I think there's still more beers, maybe?
Yeah.